Hello and welcome back for the last time to Beyond Networks, the evolution of living systems. If you've come with me all the way from the beginning, and you've come a long way, it's been quite a journey also for me. It's been exhausting at times. It all had to go very quick, so a lot of it isn't perfect. It was improvised. But thank you for following me on this journey. It's a process, and the process will go on. Hopefully in future years, I will revise, make it better, and also maybe turn it finally into a book, which I should and which I plan to do. What I've tried to do in this sort of course is to give you a new perspective on evolution. But not only that, also on the kind of way we do science. And I think we're going to sort of reflect a little bit on both of those. So what does that mean, this new perspective for evolutionary biology? And what does it mean for the way we do science? What kind of approaches should we have? Conversations? What kind of collaborations do we need to make this happen, to truly move beyond networks? And it's quite a big step. So this is one of the problems that I wanted to get across here. You can come, just like the extended synthesis people do, and say, okay, there is a causal structure of evolution and it requires reciprocal causation. But that's not taking the problem serious. What I've tried to do in this lecture is take that problem serious, and I showed you that it's not just reciprocal causation that you can build into your mechanistic models. It is truly non-mechanistic. It is co-generation. Marx, not Churchill. So basically, we have to say that Kant got it right in the end. He said biology is not fully accessible through mechanistic explanations. Well, being Kant, he said it obviously in different words. He said it would be absurd for humans even to hope that there may yet arise a Newton who would make comprehensible even the generation of a blade of grass according to natural laws. So there's no magic involved. There's no vitalism, ontological vitalism. There's no force propelling living systems. But he's right. There is no physical law that explains organisms. And in the end, there is no law as the physicists know it, because the rules are constantly rewritten. So it's a completely different type of explanation that we need. So I've been advertising these dynamic mechanistic explanations for the evolution of different processes. Not only, we've looked at developmental processes, but they could be metabolic processes, physiological processes, and also, and that's very important, the evolution of behavior. So you can use these approaches very, very, very well, I think, in cultural evolution as well, okay? Because it's very processual. And I suggested, just like Kant did, to take these mechanistic approaches and push them as hard as we can. How far can we get? Probe the limits. And then when we can't go any further, then we have to switch. And that's where we talk about the organization of the organism, of course. And Kant, as one of the first philosophers, realized that organisms are different from non-living systems because they have both the ends and the means of being within themselves. So they have intrinsic purpose, and there is no way around this. So basically, we have to accept teleological explanations for the organism as a whole. The organism is a natural agent in its environment, its perceived environment. And the kind of teleological explanation that we need is a completely scientific, naturalistic teleological explanation. Unlike the one that talks about evolution going somewhere, like the omega point hypothesis. It doesn't involve magical causal influences from the future or from non-existing worlds. It doesn't require consciousness on the part of the organism, and it doesn't, introduce any kind of illegal normativity other than that the organism actually does have goals. It wants to live, okay? We should take that serious. And we can take that serious within scientific theorizing. So we've looked at approaches that are in biology, in philosophy. We need to move on with biologists and philosophers working together. This is one thing we're going to discuss today. Okay? But we are not stepping outside what we would reasonably call science at all. Even those teleological explanations stay within science. There is no ontological vitalism here, but what Dennis Walsh has called methodological vitalism, which is something we can, as biologists, probably all agree on, that we need different methods to study living systems than non-living systems. That's all. It's absurd to think that we do not. So biology isn't just physics or chemistry. That's one basic truth. As biologists, we probably all believe in that somewhere deep down, but we have to take that serious and explain why. And for that, we have to take organisms serious again, okay? The organism has vanished just for 100 years as the center of biology, and it's time to put it back at the center. So I call this approach, Immanuel Kant actually had a name for it, it's teleomechanism. We could call it like that, version 2.0 or teleomechanism redux. We push mechanistic explanation as far as we can in biology, but not further than that. And from there on, we need teleological explanation, and we need to take that serious. And we need to be careful that we don't use the wrong kind of teleological explanation, because that is not scientific. So we have to embrace the organicism, like the organicist movement of biological systems. And the machine metaphors that we use, there are crude ones, computers and programs, but there are more subtle ones like the network here. It's an engineering metaphor. It's not a good metaphor for the organism. It's not taking it serious enough. And these types of metaphors can be very useful. I told you that, for coming up with new concepts, forming new concepts, being able to talk about phenomena that you don't have words for, etc. But sometimes they build this sort of illusion that you think you know something because you're familiar with the term where the metaphor comes from, but it doesn't really reflect what's really going on. This is what I said in the very first lecture. We live in this sort of hyper-normal reality right now. We have theories that we know are not adequate, but we don't have either the time or the courage or the interest to step out of that sort of world, and it's time to do that again. So I don't think networks are good metaphors for organisms, but I do think this sort of network is a very good metaphor for this biopsychological thicket, this area of reality where biology and also the social sciences, psychology, sociology, anthropology, everything lives. And it's very different in its structure than a lot of the rest of the universe. It's not clearly structured into levels of organization like the realms of the very small or the very large, depicted here at the bottom or at the top. But it's not clearly structured into levels. So it's a thicket, and we need to cut through this thicket with perspectives. And the more complex the system we're studying, the more perspectives we need. I introduced this sort of idea of the rainforest ontology by Wimsatt, that there are so many levels of organization. This is a realist philosophy. These levels are real. There is something in reality that is reflected in our interaction with it, where these levels come out. They are these peaks of predictability and regularity, in Wimsatt's term. And we have to take that serious. And our world has this sort of structure that the further down you go, here it says, the entification is greater at lower levels. So basically, entities and levels are much more cleanly separated the further away you go from this messy thicket that we're in here in the biological and the social realm. So we need a completely different approach philosophically. This is a metaphysical sort of argument, okay? So instead of generalized laws and theories that I put in scare quotes here, because they're just broad models, but also they have a limited domain of application. There is no theory of everything, although some physicists are still looking for it. Instead of that, you need very specific models and perspectives. And often, remember that, I'm saying it again, for complex systems, you need multiple perspectives for the same system. Okay, it's a very different approach. And so we've moved on from this, sort of logical positivism idea of science which was based on physics, to this much more adequate and modern view of how to do science in the biological realm. But a lot of the sort of motivations we have implicitly still come from that old-fashioned view of the philosophy of science. That's one way to put it. The other thing is that if you live in this sort of multi-perspectival jungle there, you will come up with different ways of studying the system. And you don't have to agree that these are good ways. You can stay in your own perspective. You have to, you have to explicitly develop your own perspective to be successful here. And so we've read Jim Grismer's paper in the seminar that accompanies this lecture at the University of Vienna, and the discussion was came to the point where someone said, he's much too nice. He wants to, accept everything, and that's not true. So let's read this quote. I urge trans-perspective cooperation in the service of comparative analysis. Okay, yes, we need to cooperate, and we need to try and figure out what's going on in those other perspectives. But he says robustness analysis, so this comparison between perspectives that gives you a better view of what they're doing well and what they're not, of the sort I advocate, requires patient attention to those research packages one does not adopt. Two things in here. Patient, I haven't highlighted it, but it's very important. So you need to be patient because it's not your perspective. You don't like it, the other perspective. I don't like Richard Dawkins' perspective of the replicator. I really don't, okay? And I do not adopt it. But I find it useful and I'm seriously engaging with it because it's telling me something about evolution that I need to know. And it motivates my own process perspective on evolution. I'm trying to contextualize that replicator perspective. Okay, he says this sort of attention to others' perspective is for the sake of learning about the prospects and limitations of the one perspective to which one has made a primary commitment. This is the only way you can step out of your own head, really, or that of your local community, is to see the world through someone else's eyes. And you can do that. We don't do that often enough. When do you see this happen? These are conversations we need to have, okay? We need to have arguments. We can disagree, but we need to take each other serious. This is not happening. Take the extended evolutions debate, okay? You have people on one side postulating their, theses, and people postulating on the other side, and they postulate at each other. And one says, yes, we need a synthesis. The other one says, no, we don't. And that's basically, if you go through the literature and read stuff, that's it, Doesn't go much further than this. This is not useful at all, okay? It's much more useful to say, okay, what do you actually want? What do you think evolutionary biology is, and why do you think that? Try to understand the other person. Try to have these sort of conversations. That's not happening because we have all these big professors in a sort of a climate where often you have these people are extremely allergic to criticism. That's one problem, okay? So you have people, you criticize their theory and they're personally offended. Well, that's not right. If somebody's arguing about your theory, you shouldn't take that personal. In fact, you should constantly be challenging your theory yourself. But I know so many characters, especially in this debate, on both sides, that are allergic. They don't want to have an argument. They want to win an argument. That's different, and that's not very useful. So let's argue, let's disagree, but let's take each other serious. That would be a great thing. The other thing is let's keep the attacks, on the theories, not ad hominem. I got some feedback about the extended synthesis lecture that said, hey, that was sort of ad hominem at the people who, are doing the synthesis. I don't think so. I criticize the content and the philosophical foundations of their efforts. And they are taking that personally. Some of them. I shouldn't say they. I had a lot of very good feedback. Thank you for that. But some people have taken this very personally. So where is the sort of discussion culture that we need where you can challenge each other? It's a game. It has to be a game. It's very serious. Don't get me wrong. It's not suggesting it's not serious, but I'm saying if you don't play that game, if you don't go back and forth and criticize each other very vigorously all the time, and even your own ideas, we are not making progress. And that's one of the big problems. In the lecture about Evo theory, you had all these verbal vague theories, you know, epigenetic innovation theory, I don't know what else. They're formulated in a way that they're almost like Freudian psychoanalysis. You can't actually test those things. Okay, and also, especially in this example, you know, the epigenetic innovations, I don't see any sort of progress or empirical confirmation or rigorous testing going on. Nothing, okay? And so the same problem seems to be arising again now with the extended synthesis. So we need precise, so the sort of proposals, the perspectives we should formulate should be precise as possible, quantitative if possible, you can't always be, and also, and that's very important, and I'll repeat it over and over again, they have to be philosophically better informed than what we have now. So the level of sort of the philosophy that's involved in the extended synthesis debate, for example, you know, Lakatos research programs and, you know, Kuhnian paradigms, it's not adequate. Here, this Wimsattian perspectivism is one philosophy that is great, you know, and is being actively developed by Michele Massimi and Jim Grismer and other people today. Okay, so let's work, and young philosophers, you know, some of which I work with, like James DeFrisco, Dan Brooks. Even, you know, then there's process philosophy. There's all kinds of stuff that's much more adequate, much more up to date. Dan Nicholson's work, all these sort of people. I'm just dropping names here, and I apologize to everyone I haven't, you know, mentioned here. There's a lot of really interesting work going on in the philosophy of biology, and I think the most interesting work is that intervenes. It's not a sort of a philosophy of biology that just studies biologists and looks at, oh, what are they doing? Okay, you can do that. But I'm a biologist. I know that the current success of some sort of approach doesn't mean it's very robust in Wimsatt's term. It's very grounded in reality, because it could just be a collective, you know, temporary delusion. I mean, the scientific method is really good on a longer time scale to sort of run things against reality and filter out theories that are long-term successful. They're usually robust. Okay, so they get more and more established. But also, the flip side of this coin is that a new theory, if you look at Wimsatt's theory and sort of robustness, a new perspective cannot be robust. So we need to be open-minded to new perspectives that are not very well established yet. And this sort of perspectival philosophy is really, really powerful in sort of motivating this very practical behavior. So let's try and engage. Let's agree to disagree. Let's be open to new ideas, because when they get, you know, born, they are not robust on principle yet. Okay, so these are very important points, and they're all sort of informed by this. It's a coherent philosophy, but it's perspectival. So it doesn't aim at unification of everything. That's very important. So I've spent a lot of time on this slide because it's really, really crucial, the point that it's making. We need a new kind of discussion, a new kind of way of pushing theory forward, not just in evolutionary biology. Okay, so I think this is the best way of structuring the problems. For me, it makes sense. I mean, you can choose other perspectives. These are the ones I've chosen based on Jim Grismer's paper and Dennis Wall's book. We looked at the structural perspective, functional perspective, process perspectives, agential perspectives. And I was making the argument that it's mainly process perspectives and agential perspectives that we need to develop further. We had this minimal model of Lewontin's sort of interpretation of Darwin, that we have a population of organisms, there's phenotypic variation, there's some form of inheritance, and there's some sort of fitness consequences to the variation, and you get evolution. And I think this is a very powerful core of evolutionary theory that goes straight back to Darwin. Dennis was arguing that Darwin's theory was all about the struggle, that all this dynamic came out of the struggle of each individual's life. But sort of, if you that doesn't mean the other perspectives are less valuable, and there's still lots of open questions. But I think since process perspectives, for example, are underdeveloped, they will help us position and show the flaws or the limitations of other perspectives. So we should invest most time in there right now. But that's just my own opinion. That's not a perspective, that's just an opinion. Okay, so if you do cultural evolution, structural perspectives, the unit of selection debate is extremely important there because it's not resolved yet or settled. Like in biology, it is more, well, no, I mean, no. Okay, but it's better established than in cultural evolution. And also functional perspectives, what are the replicators of cultural evolution? Nobody knows yet. So you need to pay attention to all of these perspectives if you do any sort of evolutionary theory. That's very important. Okay, so for me, it makes a lot of sense to sort of, structure the problems like this and to say, okay, but if we want a true understanding of evolution, we need to understand all of those. And especially the organism as an agent is something it's extremely underexplored and it's difficult to do. It requires a radically new approach. So let's try. Why are we not trying? Why isn't nothing happening? Why are all these supposed revolutions that we have? This is another thing that makes me mad. If you look at Evo Devo, the extended synthesis, everyone from Stephen Jay Gould, who was the world champion in this, he claimed that he had completely rewritten evolutionary theory in his absolutely monumental book, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, which I didn't even get past the description of the frontispiece because it's like 100 pages. It's amazing. But he didn't reinvent evolutionary theory. And so time after time, you have someone coming up with a, facilitated variation. Oh, this is a completely, punctuated equilibrium. It's a completely new theory. Plasticity first, completely new theory. I don't think so, but, so what we're doing is we're providing new perspectives on specific problems, which are very interesting, but we're not reinventing the wheel. But on the other hand, if we come up with an agential perspective on evolution, this will be a truly novel and different theory of evolution. It will not just be different as a theory of evolution, it will be different as a scientific theory because it will employ types of explanation that no other scientific theory currently does, or explicitly admits to be doing, at least. So teleological explanations of the kinds that we've naturalized and shown to be completely okay in the last lecture. Okay, so this is a big task. And I think this sort of looking at the problem is very productive because it shows you where the work is, okay? So what is it then with this perspectivism? Is it just like everybody is entitled to their own opinion? This is what Vice President Mike Pence once said, apparently. And, well, you may be entitled to your own opinion, but, this is like, free speech. It means that you can say what you think, but it doesn't mean that other people can't criticize you. Everybody has to like what you're saying, right? So there is a problem here, okay? So there are good perspectives and there are bad perspectives. Wimsatt's philosophy is a realism, a type of realism. So Geary, I should mention as well. So perspectivism, scientific perspectivism is a realist philosophy. So it says there is a reality out there that constrains our theories of it in a way. We are in contact with it, okay? So we can learn something about it. It's not this sort of Ding an sich, like Kant's thing, that the reality is out there, but we can never access it. We're in constant interaction with it. So there is some sort of almost like a evolution by selection going on there in terms of how science evolves itself. But that's not a topic I'm going to cover in this lecture explicitly. Okay, so what we have to be careful of is to sort of drift from perspectivism into some sort of postmodernist sort of everything goes, right? And so there are many, many variations of this, and some of them are not postmodernist at all. But there's this thing called pluralism, right? I mean, what we're saying basically is we have to sort of diversify evolutionary theory with different perspectives. So is anything okay? Is anything a good perspective? So there's a beautiful little rant by Dave Bernstein from 1989, and he's talking about different types of debates in philosophy. And so he distinguishes what he calls flabby from engaged pluralism. So flabby pluralism is like, oh, dinner conversation, oh, this is interesting point of view, but in reality, you think like this is completely nuts, okay? While engaged pluralism is taking our own fallibility really seriously. So it's sort of trying to understand, it's a perspectival pluralism where you're trying to understand your own limitations by talking to other people and trying to understand their point of view in a serious way, which doesn't mean you shouldn't judge them, okay? So this is not like the acceptance of everything. And so this is, it's rather, on the other hand, it's like, I love this subtitle of Wimsatt's book, which is called Piecewise Approximations to Reality. It is doing serious scientific, robust scientific work, but on specific problems. So intriguingly, perspectives are intriguingly quasi-subjective. Observer, technique, technology, relative cuts on the phenomenon of the system. But the reality is interacting with you, and there are valid perspectives and invalid perspectives, okay? So it's not the same as sort of accepting, some sort of postmodernism, accepting any, deconstructing everything, first of all, or accepting any kinds of different viewpoints as valid, okay? That's not the case here. And it's also, there's a very sort of common school, especially in the US at the moment, of philosophers of science that are sort of taking biological approaches, successful biological approaches, as sort of the measure of all things. Okay, and I can tell you, I've been a biologist long enough that a lot of biologists, they only know about their own peculiar little corner of the world, and they can't contextualize their theories. They don't know anything about the theory of knowledge or anything about metaphysics. Okay, and often they use terms inconsistently without knowing it. Okay, often they extrapolate their ideas outside their domain without shame or reflection. So it's really dangerous to take what scientists among themselves are, successfully using as the measure of all things. So sort of a very pragmatic approach. I think that's very dangerous because often scientists are wrong. So philosophers shouldn't be shy and intervene, okay? Collaborate with the scientists and say, let's work together. We need better approaches, okay? So for me, the philosophy of biology should also do a sort of a theoretical biology that has almost been forgotten, okay? Which is a philosophical kind of biology. It's unfundable today. Nobody does it anymore. We're all too busy sequencing one thing or another. It's a real loss, and we need it back, okay? So this course, if anything, is a manifesto to get that back. So some, but not all, the problems that we are dealing with are multi-perspectival, okay? So complex systems, in Wimsatt's argument, is sort of requires different perspectives for a full understanding. But before you just go, and everybody will say the problem I'm working on is complex. Well, you need to sort of figure that out first. Maybe it's not, okay? And so Wimsatt writes, here, if anywhere, philosophers may be useful if they know the lay of the land. And it would be good for biologists, even if they know everything about their little corner of the world, to listen to the philosophers for once, because they actually have a broader picture. Not a synthetic picture, but a perspectival picture, maybe. A realistic picture of how knowledge is gained and where it is useful to unify it. So it's not a grand unification, for sure, either, perspectivism, okay? And here, we've been over this a couple of times, but grand unified theories are simply not realistic in evolutionary biology because we're in this thicket, okay? It's just not gonna work. And even Darwin's theory is very, as Dennis Walsh has noticed, is very sort of metaphysically modest, okay? It just takes the struggle of each individual as its basis, okay? And that's why it's so successful and so broadly applicable in biology. But we cannot hope that everything is like that. A lot of the phenomena we're looking at are very, 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 very radically context dependent here. And it gets worse in psychology and social sciences, of course. There's this whole debate about generalizability of psychological results. The whole reproducibility crisis may not be about reproducibility, but about our inability to generalize psychological insights, okay? Same may be applying here. And so I don't think we need grand unified theories, like a compact theory based on few assumptions that explains a lot. We don't need this, okay? But we'll come back to that point, okay? So these are not realistic, and they come, the motivation, as we've seen in the extended synthesis lecture, they come from logical positivism, which is long dead in philosophy of science. I can just say that once more. It's not a tenable philosophy anymore. Okay, so there is no need to have a unified picture, grand unified picture like that. And in fact, most problems with evolutionary biology arise from perspectives that transgress their limits. One beautiful example is evolutionary psychology, which takes a very reductionist genetic view of evolution and applies it to human behavior, in most cases with absolutely gruesome and fatal consequences. Okay, talking about bullshit, that is a discipline where bullshit is very rich and rife. Okay, there is good work in this discipline as well, but there is a lot of the other thing. And that's, of course, also because we have very little evidence on what we in our natural state look like, or what human beings even, what that even means. Yes, but I mean, here you cannot just extrapolate some sort of basic reductionist evolutionary genetics to human evolution. It has such a different context, different complexities, and it's just not useful to sort of try and have one explanation that covers all of that. Okay, and often it goes terribly wrong in evolutionary psychology. I don't want to blame anyone in specific, specifically. There are lots of fields where, I mean, Dawkins' sort of thing is just a point of view, right? The selfish gene, but it's a typical example of a perspective that is actually interesting in and of itself, metastasizing all over the place and sort of getting applied in places where it really shouldn't be. Like the extended phenotype is crazy. I think it's crazy. I don't know about you. Okay, so this is how, by our almost complete ignorance of the proper domains of application for most evolutionary perspectives, we have no sort of theoretical understanding of how theories apply in this field, especially not for scientists. I mean, philosophers of biology are gaining more and more insight into this and are taking biology more and more serious compared to physics. And there's some really interesting stuff coming out of there. So you should be paying attention to that as a biologist, because this is going to be extremely important if we're going to push the field forward or not. So, and this is sort of, I mean, because of all of this, we really do not want another synthesis in evolutionary biology. We want a rich and diverse zoo of valid perspectives that are not flabby pluralism, that disagree, that point out different views. They are in friction with each other. They inform each other that way. They show each other's limitations. That's not a nice thing. You're going to get upset. But these are, they are not competing. They are collaborating, but in a very argumentative way. Okay? So they're not going against each other. It's not like winner takes it all, but they're not going to just be peacefully. It's not just, one thing after the other. Some of them are more useful in some contexts and are not, and some are not. And this needs to be argued at. We need to have a better culture for argumentation. We need to involve young researchers more. The professors need to come down from their pedestals and their, theories and their sort of, I'm offended because you criticize my theory. And this is costing people jobs in the field right now. We know that, right? There are people, because of these feuds that exist, that are not getting jobs one or the other way. And this is unethical. I'm sorry. This is just stupid. Okay, so we need better theorizing than this, basically. Okay, and what I mean is not necessarily better math tools, although that is a big, if this agential perspective is coming through, we need a new kind of math. But what I mean here is philosophically informed, reflected, well-grounded theory that is doing something in a robust way. Okay, that is totally adapted to our finiteness, piecewise approximation heuristics. We know this, informed by philosophy. I think that's very important. This is not like that, and it's not useful, in my opinion. So what we need is a really serious interaction between philosophers and and biologists, not some sort of rivalry between the two fields. Because for us to really push forward, we need scientists and philosophers to collaborate together. So the philosophers are not, like Feynman once said, as important to Feynman said, philosophers are as important to scientists as bird watchers are to birds. I think that's totally wrong. We need philosophers right now to tell us about this territory, the terrain, the lay of the land that Wimsatt is writing about. What are explanations? What are the theories that we need? Because we need new kinds of explanations if we want to take the organism serious. We can't just talk about extending the synthesis and reciprocal causation. This is going to be a radically new theory, and it's going to be have to be philosophically grounded. Okay, so what is the most, what is it then? So it's, I would call it sort of what we should do is what I would call reasonable reduction and unification. I'm going to base this on Wimsatt. He doesn't call it reasonable reduction, but it's sort of a reduction that works. He has an account of this in his book. And so it's aware of the fact that we're not, so reductionism works really well down here. You can, explain phenomena at one level by phenomena at the other level, but here it's more difficult. And anyway, Wimsatt has a few really interesting reflections. So he's saying basically what we should try is explain a phenomenon always first at its own level. Okay, if you can do that, if you have a really good theory that works at the level of the phenomenon itself, then there is no need for reduction. But then if there are a lot of sort of phenomena that you can't explain, then you move down, okay, because that's the world we have. If that's not possible, so we explain the phenomenon as a product of causes at a lower level. So that's what he calls reductive explanation, and it's the same as what we call mechanistic explanation. That's why we do it, because the world is structured like that. It's a reasonable way to go about it. And the least desirable, probable of our reductionist schemes is explanation in terms of higher level causes. So this sort of reverse reductionism, I don't know what to call that, which he calls functional explanation, which is, of course, some form usually of teleological explanation, either in the form of teleonomy, the action of natural selection, wings are for flying, or as we've seen now, the intrinsic teleology of the organism, okay, happens at a higher level of organization than the parts of the organism. So we explain the parts by the whole, in a way. But it's not just sort of this Russian doll space scale, model of the world. Okay, so these levels, higher, lower, doesn't necessarily mean direct equivalence at the scale, space scale. It's much more complicated because we're in this thicket. There is no clear level structure. Okay, and then, and I find this really interesting, this is a paper I read this week by James DeFrisco, it's a review of a book, and he writes in there that we should have at least a minimal unificationist commitment, okay? So what he says is, we shouldn't accept pluralism by default. The existence of an apparent plurality of meanings, definitions, extensions for the same scientific concept or kind cannot be an ultimate brute fact, but must admit of a deeper explanation, which is based, at least in part, in mind independent features of the world. So, it can't be entirely subjective. So this is almost like a modern and workable version of Occam's razor, that if you don't have a reason to have multiple meanings of the same term, it shouldn't be the same term. Okay, so you have to have a deeper explanation. And in the same way, just like for the plurality of meaning, you can also say for the plurality of perspectives, you need to have a reason why it is important to have a plurality of perspectives for any sort of problem. You shouldn't just multiply your perspectives just like that. It's not the idea. Okay, so a reasoned and sort of not a greedy way of multiplying perspectives. So both reduction and pluralism should be used in a moderate sort of sense. They're useful. Okay, so I'm not anti-reductionist here. I think they're great. It's our only way to understand large parts of the world. Okay. So this would be a philosophically informed sort of practical guide what to do, right? So we try to be as unificationist as possible. But we have to, argue about why, the reasons behind those sort of things. And it's okay to be reductionist, but you have to sort of be careful not to overextend that. And that's what's happening right now. So on that note, we really need a different kind of conversation. I think this has come across time and again here. And I love this quote by Bill Wimsatt. I'm going to show it to you again. If this explanation for their occurrence is correct or nearly so, an unusually large fraction of the disputes should be resolvable. So people talking past each other, that is the explanation. As people from different groups learn and work out how to talk with one another instead of past each other. If, and it is a big sociological if, they maintain a commitment to try to understand one another rather than bloating their reputations by taking cheap shots at the opposition. The Nature 2014 extended synthesis thing is taking cheap shots, both sides. Terrible, everything, terrible, bad. It's not even a discussion. It's just totally, talking past each other. And there's nothing going to come out of this. And he writes, this is perhaps the deepest pragmatic commitment of science, that it is in one's interest to come up to understand differences and then to resolve them. I'm not even sure about resolving them. If you understand them, you can agree to disagree. It's fine. Okay. You don't have to resolve all the differences, but trying to resolve them, unification, this sort of minimal unification, you always try. Maybe you fail, and that's interesting too. So this is something that Wimsatt also talks about a lot in his book, about how much you can learn by the failure of reductionism, about non-aggregativity, emergence, and all these kind of things. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough time to go into this, but please read his book. If you only read one philosophy book in your life, make it. Re-engineering philosophy for limited beings, if you're a scientist. Otherwise, there's lots of other good books out there as well. Okay, so basically, let's wrap up. I think we're in a situation where the evolutionary theories we have built are simple. They work in certain places, but they're fragile. They need very specific conditions to be met to actually work, and they miss a lot of the interesting stuff that's going on completely. So much that we don't even know it exists. So this problem of taking the organism as an agent serious in evolutionary theory rarely occurs to any evolutionary theorists. And this is a really strange thing. Okay, I don't understand this. I mean, this is one at the bottom of Darwin's theory. If you read the book, who reads The Origin of Species? It's really the struggle for life that's really important there. And so we need to embrace the true complexity of evolution. We live in this sort of space, just sort of this argument about the extended synthesis, the opponents that said, it's fine. Our theory is fine. It's just bizarre. How can you say that as a scientist? It's fine. What is that? Like you're writing a paper and in the discussion you write, everything that is worth saying in this field has already been said. Thank you and goodbye. I'm going for a beer. This is not how science works. It's just absurd. So the fact that this is another reason why this debate is there is no point to make against changing your current theory. It's absurd. And you shouldn't be in science if you do this. I mean, I'm sorry I'm going to offend people here, but seriously, you are constantly reworking your theory. And obviously that is intuitively clear to you. So don't make that argument. It's just fake news, okay? So we need to have better theories. There is a lot to be learned about evolution. I don't think anyone in the field would contest that. And, these sort of, you may think even the process stuff was crazy, but this agential thing is completely nuts. Okay, that's true. But I think by just philosophically thinking about it right now, maybe we will not ever have any sort of practical models, or as I said, it's probably not going to be predictable. But one thing it does for us is it situates where we stand. Situated Darwinism is what Dennis Walsh called it. It knows where it is. And it knows the simplifying and idealizing assumption it's making. And it knows when it breaks down, that it doesn't explain everything. I think that's very important. That's really worth trying. And it's really urgent that we do this. Because, like so many things in our society, the views we have built here are not good. They're not reflecting reality. and it gives us the illusion of control and prediction that is just not there. So open your eyes, take that red pill, and welcome to the jungle of the emergent co-origination of everything. This is what the world is at bottom. And funnily enough, Buddhist philosophers like Nagarjuna already knew this in a way. It's really hard to interpret those texts sometimes, but they had a view of the world like this. And this is what's happening. Marx, Lewontin, Levins, and Dennis Walsh agree. So at bottom, if you talk about the causal structure of evolution, and therefore also of the universe, because evolution is an important part of it, then you have this constantly radically emergent sort of appearance of rules. The future is open. It's a beautiful processual view. It's very similar in many ways to Whitehead's view of the universe, which he called the philosophy of the organism. He said the universe is much more like an organism than a machine. So instead of making organisms machine, we should make the universe an organism again. So let's explore this. Who's joining the suicidal mission? You're not going to get funded. We need to first work on the conditions to get ourselves heard. I think it can be done. A lot of changes need to be happen. These are difficult times, but they're great times for a change. So let's do it. Thanks for listening. If you have questions you want to discuss, please contact me, comment on YouTube, and I'll hope to meet you in the future, and we'll have a productive argument, disagreement, a conversation. And after that, we have a beer. Thank you very much, and goodbye.